I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
breaking unemployment records.
Exactly. Just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee.
And maybe a few drinks.
We realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists
are taking a critical look at American media.
Dom, so what do you think it even means to be a journalist anymore?
Jenna, I have absolutely no idea anymore. Honestly, I mean, with news influencers and, everybody's online, you just don't know who you're getting information from anymore. So I honestly don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And what's worse is that everybody insists that they're an expert. So actually, that's why we decided we're going to reach out to an actual expert, Kelly McBride. She's a leading voice on journalism ethics. But to get us into this conversation, we also needed some comic relief.
See, once upon a time we had respectable journalists reporting on facts. Then the networks got purchased by the worst people on earth and converted to fear machines. Don't even get me started on social media.
So Jenna, tell everybody how you found this.
Well, I was disassociating on TikTok, as one does, just kind of scrolling. But that's how I discovered Paul. And I just love the song because it so perfectly captured how I feel.
How everyone feels. And we're journalists.
Which is wild. So I reached out to Paul to find out how he managed to capture this moment in journalism.
Well, interestingly, when I wrote it, I didn't really have any of that sort of agenda. And I think part of its effectiveness comes from that. I think where I personally, and I think a lot of, artists and creatives can relate, when you go into it with the mindset of, I've got something to say, I want to be the change I'm going to see in the world, that's where I can tend to get stuck. Because you start to think in terms of what's going to make this message palatable. How, but when it just comes from, here's just a thing that I'm feeling that I'm going to try to express as clearly as I can, that is kind of personal to me. And that I think the fact that people relate to it on that level is kind of a surprising and wonderful afterthought. As far as what's important to me about it, I do think that just this general idea that media is not focused on giving you accurate information. And I think I'm really kind of one of the last vestiges of a generation where I was taught that in school. We were taught about media bias and taught about, even in this agonizing process of writing papers and having to do MLA citations and sort of beaten into our heads, you need to check where your information is coming from. And I feel really lucky that I had that. Because, as you said, now it can be really hard to tell the difference between real information and just somebody's opinion. Even in news media, very often you're seeing people making really sweeping proclamatory statements about really important issues, and you're not seeing citations. You're not seeing, where they're getting this data from. There's a lot of, I always say there's sort of the rhetorical kind of triggers you can hear of, everyone is saying this, and everybody knows. It's
Gotta love that round table.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows anything. And not only that, but this idea that if everybody assumes a thing to be true, therefore it's true. In my experience, if everybody assumes a thing to be true, that's compelling evidence that it's total bullshit.
Paul makes some excellent points here, and we'll have a full interview with him in a bonus episode coming out soon.
However, we still wanted to understand why the word journalist has gotten so vague lately.
So we reached out to someone who could answer our burning question. Who even is a journalist nowadays? what does it even mean to be a journalist anymore? It seems like anyone can hop on the internet claiming to be a journalist and claim to inform an unsuspecting public on, frankly, anything. So, to try to get to the bottom of this incredibly critical question right now, we're joined by Kelly McBride, one of the leading voices in journalism ethics and newsroom transformation. Kelly's senior vice president and chair of the Craig Newmark Center for Ethics and Leadership at the Poynter Institute, where she helps media organizations navigate thorny questions like trust, bias, and editorial integrity in a rapidly changing industry. Kelly also served as the public editor at NPR, helping the public understand how journalism works and pushing for transparency in the newsroom. Her career spans decades of work of accountability in journalism, and she's been a consistent advocate for clearer standards and better leadership at a time when the media faces internal disruption and external pressure. So today we're digging into the crossroads of journalism, ethics, AI, newsroom, and culture and where they collide. So, Kelly, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, yeah, first, I think we should start with the most critical question that seems to be really weighing on my conscience right now. What is a journalist anymore? Since it seems like anybody can claim that they are.
Yeah, well, the reason that that question is weighing on your mind is because we can't answer it. We don't have a way of determining who a journalist is. I can tell you what journalism is, right? And so I guess the best definition of who is a journalist is it's a person who does journalism. And journalism is an act of creating information for the public good, right? And it is based on turning up facts and then putting those facts into a story, into a way of distributing them in a way that informs the public, right? So the public good part of it is really the only way to determine if something is journalism, right? So you look at you can look at a post on Instagram, or you can look at a story in a newspaper, or you can look at a podcast, and you can ask yourself, does this create public good? And if it does, then in general, it's journalism. I guess the other thing that I would add to that is it fact-based? Because there are things that create public good that are not fact-based, right? That's what entertainment is.
Literally, I was about to ask, I'm like, but then gossip, because gossip makes a lot of people feel good.
In the Venn diagram between journalism and gossip, there's a significant overlap right there.
Yeah. Well, Dom?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I was wondering if you could go just a little bit deeper and kind of unpack when you talk about doing journalism, like, yeah, I think most people get that this is about, the public good and informing the public, but there's more to it when it comes to the ethics and the tools that journalists use to build or craft a story that is, factual, that is correct, and yet tells an actual story.
Right. Right. So in the act of journalism, a bunch of things have to happen. And you mentioned the word craft, right? So the journalism is a craft. You are literally creating things. It's a creative act. And so there is a craft of storytelling. There is a craft of video storytelling. There's a craft of investigating, right? Which is where you go out and you actually find out new facts that have not previously been disseminated widely. And so those are all tools that you would use in journalism. And some people are really, really good at them, right? Like when you read a really great writer, you just recognize the skill at which that writer has applied to the journalism that they're doing. But then when you talk about ethics, right? Ethics in journalism grow out of the relationship between the journalist and, if that journalist is part of an organization or a newsroom, that newsroom. So that entity, and then the audience that they intend to serve. Right? So there's a relationship. And if you think about, I mean, think about like marriage, right? And like how there's different rules in all these different marriages, right? Like in some marriages are open and most are not. And in some marriages, there's a distribution of labor and some are not. In some marriages, there are certain agreements around money. Well, the same is true in the relationship between journalists and their audience. Journalists make different promises to their audience, and their ethics grow out of that promise. So, a news organization that promises to bring you news about the business world, right? Like the Wall Street Journal, they definitely have a different set of ethical standards than, say, National Public Radio, right? The organization that I work for as the public editor. National Public Radio promises to bring their audience information about culture and politics and the entire country, and to help their audience know the world better. Different promise means different standards as you pursue the journalism. And that's because the journalism itself is resource constrained, right? Like nobody can actually fulfill the promise that they make because nobody has, the caveat is, comma, with the resources that we have available to us, we'll make the best decisions. And so the Wall Street Journal turns all of its resources toward covering the business world. Right. And they cover politics, they cover some other things, but as it relates to business. National Public Radio has its resources spread far and wide. And so they make different decisions about what to cover every day. And that's an ethical choice, right? Just what stories are you going to do is an ethical choice. And so your ethics grow out of this promise that you make to the audience. And to the extent that those promises are mysterious sometimes because they're not explicit, and they aren't talked about often, they might be talked about a little bit, but they're not talked about every day. And the audience, and unlike in a marriage, right, where two people stand at an altar and both of them agree to be part of it, the audience doesn't ever like actually formally agree to be in a relationship with the news organization. They just sort of pick every once in a while what they want to get information from. So it's more like a menu for the audience. That is that makes it messy, right? It makes it very, very messy because your ethics are basically a fulfillment of a promise. And how are you going to fulfill that promise? And if you have promised to bring people the truth around politics, then eventually you're going to have to decide in political reporting whether you're going to give people anonymity in order to get information out of them, right? And if you go back to your promise to the audience, there's probably no way that you can deliver on that promise without giving people anonymity. But then the other part of that promise is you said truth. And anonymity can actually compromise the truth if you don't have some safeguards in place, because you want to make sure you're not getting played, right? You want to make sure you're not being spun by somebody who's doing it under the cloak of anonymity, so nothing's going to come back to them. So as a journalist, right, your ethics then go back to this promise: I'm going to give my audience the truth about politics. I'm going to have to grant some people anonymity. I'm going to have to put some mechanisms in place to make sure that what they're telling me is true, right? That falls on me, not on the source, not on the audience, right? As the journalist, now I have a duty, because I've entered into these relationships, to make sure that this information that the source is telling me is true, is complete, that I have all the context, and knowing that my source probably has a completely different motive for telling me this information. I can't necessarily rely on the source. So now I need to bring all these other tools into play, like verification and triangulation and just basic fact checking. Um, right, like, and so if you look at other professions like medicine, right? Medicine has a really refined code of ethics, and they have developed that code of ethics based on the relationship between the doctor and the patient, but they have been able to universalize it, right? So, like, if you are a licensed doctor in the United States, your ethics are expected to be roughly the same, no matter what state you're working in, no matter whether you're a private physician or whether you're working for a hospital. Journalism, not so much, right? Journalism, it's
Nope.
different in every situation. So a lot of times that leads people to say, well, journalists have no ethics. And they may not be very good at it, but they do. Everybody has ethics. It's just that it's an informal system, which then, if it's going to work really well, requires that the journalist be aware of all these intricacies. And sometimes journalists aren't, because many journalists go into this field thinking that there's a rule book somewhere and that they're just going to follow that rule book. And it's never going to change. And they don't evolve their ability to critically think about the ethics of what they're doing.
But question for you, Kelly, here about accountability, because I feel like that's a really important aspect of when we're talking about journalists, because now we're talking about an organization, let's say like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I feel like we have a better sense of what accountability looks like. I'm also wondering, what does it look like for independent journalists too, where we're not as sure, where there isn't as much transparency, maybe to the audience. We might think there is, but sometimes do we really have that, because there's no system in check necessarily to make sure they are being held accountable.
And with so many
Yeah,
newsrooms shrinking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But also, I mean, so the the ability to get a hold of a journalist or their representative and complain to them, say, hey, you got something wrong. That is I think, a key benchmark for whether a journalist is generally ethical or not, right? Like if journalists are not responsive to the public, if a newsroom doesn't have any mechanisms, if you can't even find their emails, or if they give you a form and then nobody responds to it, right? That is problematic. Now, I know most journalists have a bunch of people in their emails and in their DMs who are just like complaining, right? And they're not making a factual assertion that the journalist got something wrong. But what they're doing is just they want to engage. And journalists have to decide like who they're going to engage with, because a lot of people aren't open to a genuine conversation. They really just want to yell at you. But you, as a journalist, you got to read all of those, and you have to be able to discern, does this person have a genuine question that I should consider? And if they do, how am I going to engage with them? But journalists who are absolutely unresponsive across the board, and news organizations that do not respond to complaints about factual accuracy specifically, that's a sign of ethical shakiness.
That is
right?
a red flag.
It is a red flag.
To me, I would say that is a huge red flag. It's interesting that you say that, though, because for me, one of my telltale signs as to whether or not I'm going to engage with someone who's commenting on my work is the answer to your question in the work that I just produced. Like, did you read it? Did you listen to it? Or are you just triggered and you, like you said, you want to yell, which some people do?
Well, right, that's a skill as a journalist, which is when somebody asks you questions, and if they're asking you questions about the work, right? Like let's say you are covering some complicated public-private partnership that's happening in your town, and the answer is in the work. you know, one answer is, yeah, if you go to paragraph 12, right? I address that there. But the other thing is if somebody has a question, that might be a sign that there's more journalism to be done, right? Like, oh, actually, this person has a question. Maybe I should do another story just addressing this question. The other thing that happens is people write and they have their own hot take that they want you to hear. Right. And sometimes all you have to do is acknowledge, like, hey, thanks for sharing this. Right. I did like read this very long email that you sent me. But sometimes they want to talk about why you're making the choices that you're making. Like, why are you covering this and not that? Or why are you
Yeah, no, that happens frequently.
this guy, not that guy? Or why did you quote him saying this, but you didn't quote somebody else making an equally prescient point on the other side? Or why are you interviewing that guy when he has these things about him that people should know before they listen to him, and you didn't share these things about him, right? And so there's all these things that the public wants to know about our work. And in journalism, we have traditionally been like a one-to-many in forms of communication, right? This is like in communication theory. And in one-to-many, we don't have to listen to the many, right? Because we are the one and there's too many of them out there. But as all of our information systems have been disrupted by technology, right? By social media and the internet, and the ability for everybody to put out information, we have really become a many-to-many mode of communication. And when you're in a many-to-many, you do have to like treat it like a relationship. And so I use the marriage analogy a lot because, if you're in a marriage and you never listen to the person that's on the other side, it's probably not a very strong relationship.
Yeah, that's going to be a sign of problem. But so I want to go back to something that you were saying that I thought was really interesting, and that is people wanting to give their hot take. And right now, I feel like with the proliferation of social media, whatever, we're almost like this hot take nation where everybody's got to have like their opinion, their hot take on just anything and everything. And sometimes when I listen to the public discourse around journalism, or more importantly, around it's usually, well, no, sometimes they complain about print too. Because I was going to say, it's usually the broadcast media that they're consuming. There seems to be a lack of discernment between straight reporting, analysis, and opinion. And I'm wondering if, from your perspective, do you see that as something that's gotten really fuzzy for a lot of people and just not getting the difference? Because a lot of the times when I see people flip out about, say, I don't know, the New York Times, I'll look at the article and I'm like, well, that was an opinion piece. What? That's not.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's on us. That's on the journalists, because we don't do a very good job, even though the New York Times tries to label their stuff. We don't do a very good job of telling the audience, this is what we want this piece of content to accomplish, right? And so an analysis is meant to be a deeper look at all the motivations of all the players, right? A piece of straight reporting is meant to just get the facts on the table. A piece of narrative journalism is meant to show you the facts through a character's experience and get you to emotionally connect with that experience. And a piece of opinion journalism is meant to persuade you to see a point of view and agree with it, right? And so we don't ever, so we might tell people like, we don't tell them if this is a straight reporting piece. We just assume that everybody gets that that's what it is, but frankly, it's not clear. There's a lot of analysis, and then we get mushy and blend those things a fair amount, right? So I would say it's really, really hard to even label in a very clean world what each of those categories are. And then we never tell the audience, hey, the reason that we're telling you this is because blank, and you can do the rest of this. You can fill in the you can fill in the blank for any story, right?
That's
And if we
interesting. I've
don't
never
tell them
considered
that,
that.
Mm-hmm.
right? If we don't tell them that, and then we get mad at them because they get mad at us, this is like problem communication, right? And so think about that just with the traditional world of journalism, and now layer on all the influencers.
Well, yeah, no,
But
I'm laughing because in the world of communications, we aren't the best communicators,
well,
even amongst each other.
but Kelly, that's
Yeah.
what's so interesting to me is that we, oftentimes like Jen and I over the past, few seasons when we've been doing this, it's been looking at how some traditional journalism will look at influencers and people on and journalists online who are reporting. And we've fallen into that ourselves sometimes of kind of trying to figure out like when you're talking about differentiating between the different types of journal, where are you coming from? I guess my question is, how then do we, I mean, if traditional journalism isn't doing a great job at it, how are we to expect independent online journalists, people who are doing this, who don't have journalism, maybe haven't studied journalism, haven't gotten degrees, but have a great skill of storytelling and being able to tell their story? How do we get others to sort of be better at labeling or understanding where this story has come from? This is the type of reporting I'm doing. Is there, I mean, is there a solution, or is there a better way for people to kind of talk about their stories that would be more understanding to the audience? Because I feel like there's an obligation as a journalist to want my audience to know where I'm coming from and not feel like I've misled them. Because I think that's the whole thing of having that bond with your audience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we are in control. I don't think we get to decide. I, as like one of the people who is considered a leading journalism ethics expert, right? I can't influence this, right? This is an organic thing that is growing and evolving. Um, we can for ourselves start to label things a little better. And we can and talk to our audiences and do that work out loud, because what we really need is for news consumers to be news literate, right? We need them to
Mm.
understand what they're consuming and what are the strengths and weaknesses. We don't need them to like not consume influencer X because that person's bad at what they do, right? You get to choose, right? This is
Mm.
it is a loud and messy information ecosystem, and everybody gets to choose where they're getting their information from. And whether you get it from a comedian or an influencer or a journalist with a Pulitzer Prize
Mhm.
or your mom, right? Those sources all have strengths and weaknesses. And as a consumer, you just need to figure out what are the strengths and weaknesses, right? Like my mom is a great source of information, but she doesn't read text messages closely. She only reads the last one. So if there's been 3 or 4 of them ahead of them, I'm talking about in the family chat,
Mhm.
and mom is sharing something with me, I need to know that she missed the other 3 text messages. And that's going to color her interpretation of what happened, right? If I get my information from an influencer who is leaning heavily on AI, chat
Mm.
GPT or something
Mhm.
like that, I need to know that that influencer may refer to something that was a hallucination.
Mhm.
But if I don't know that that influencer is leaning on chat GPT, and I don't know that chat GPT can hallucinate things, then then I don't have enough information to make decisions about the content. And
Mhm.
and so that's like, it really comes back to like we have to be smart ourselves. I love, my colleagues, there's this thing that my colleagues do. It's called Media Wise. And they hire these teen fact checkers all over the country. And the teens just look at stuff that pops up in their news feed. And then they have been trained to figure out if something is real or not. And all they do, the whole genius of it, is they just go on Instagram and TikTok and they're like, hey, did you see this? Is this true? Here's how I figured out if this was true. And they just like walk you through the steps that they use to figure out if something was true. That's really what we see people doing more and more.
I mean, you bring up, ChatGPT, but looking at AI, it's obviously something, we've seen, I believe it's Business Insider that was saying they're leaning more towards, using generative AI in their reporting, in their newsrooms. How do we see, and other newsrooms too, it's like a lot of other newsrooms are delving into this. What is the responsibility of how do newsrooms use AI, especially in terms of what they share with the audience or with their audience, readers, viewers, listeners?
So Poynter has created an entire code of ethics that newsrooms can import and use around using AI. And it's basically like a workbook and a fill in the blank. And it's based on a handful of principles. The most important ones are human in the loop, right? So we talk about that all the time. You cannot have information just going straight from AI to publish. You need human in the loop, right? Because sometimes AI comes up with some weird things. Even like, I mean, I use AI summaries all the time, right? For a meeting or a phone call or an interview that I did.
Transcriptions.
Yeah. AI transcriptions are great, but they do get words wrong, right? And, if I'm ever going to use a quote from an interview that I did, I need to go back and listen to it to make sure that that word is exactly the word. And I find mistakes in that all the time, right? So human in the loop, because we know that AI makes mistakes and we don't always know why AI makes mistakes. So human in the loop, the human is ultimately responsible. The second thing is transparency. People need to know if this was created by generative AI, people should know. There should be a way to flag it for them. It can just be a little editor's note created by generative AI. A lot of summaries at the top of articles are generated by AI. And then, a lot of newsrooms like the Washington Post are using their own bespoke AI so that you can just ask it a question and it will answer you based on just what's been reported in the Washington Post, right? So they started just with one on climate and used all their climate reporting. But then, there's others. And when you're, generally when you're searching, like when you go to the little magnifying glass and you start searching for something, you can tell whether you're getting AI answers or whether it's just a search engine popping up by the nature of it, right? Because you get a generative AI answer, it's a narrative answer. And a lot of times there's a toggle that you can go back and forth and you're like, just give me the AI search or just give me the search engine, please, not the AI chatbot. Yes. But so human in the loop and transparency are really important. The other thing that you have to figure out is what you're going to let AI do, right? Like, are you going to let AI make illustrations, which could become very realistic looking photographs, could also be infused with different sort of cultural context that you are not maybe paying attention to, right? So if I say to a chatbot, hey, give me an illustration of to go with this story about a guy getting arrested, and that might give me an illustration of a guy in handcuffs. Well, if they make those handcuffs around a black guy, right? There's a cultural assumption that's been made there by the AI, which now is my thing. So understanding what you're going to allow it to do. You can find those guidelines at poynter.org. They're
Mhm.
downloadable for anybody. They're free. And they are, AI is definitely coming for journalism, right? It is definitely going to be a part of journalism. And it's really important that journalists be part of this process and be leaning into it, because otherwise, the AI companies are going to decide how AI does journalism, right? I really would rather the journalist be part of that process.
That's such an important part of the conversation because I think some, I don't want to say all, but some, I think have a defensiveness about it where they believe they will probably say, no, I don't use AI whatsoever. And I understand this, but at the same point, it definitely feels like it is coming. And you can, maybe if you're an individual, maybe if you're an independent, maybe that's one thing. But if you're working within an organization, it feels like it is something that is going to be part. And there are good uses from
Mm-hmm.
AI.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of the thing of not being completely closed-minded to the technology. So that
Well,
I love
and
your.
if you're not using it, then you're just falling behind on the skills
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to need to use it.
Mm-hmm.
So you really should be using it. Do you want it to do the first draft of your article? I mean, I've experimented with it. I actually think I'm a better writer than AI.
Oh, I know
Um,
I am.
right
Yeah.
now, you can train AI to write the way you write. But what I have discovered is that when I write, I'm actually writing to find meaning, right? Like I'm using the writing process to discover the meaning of what I'm looking for. I don't want to skip that step, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes me a really good ethical analyst is is that I take the time to do that. So for me, like there were times when I was like, oh, Chat GPT or Claude, write this for me. And then when I look at it, it's like, oh, well, this is actually really predictable and not anything that I would ever put my name on. And second, now I don't have the opportunity to like flex the muscles in my brain to come up with those ideas. I also think that one of the things that we're discovering is that there is this desire for the human fingerprint. And people can tell, right? Like how you go on Spotify and you type in a song and then it just starts playing other songs and you
Hmm.
basically AI generated playlist. I am much more interested in a human curated playlist, right? Like I'm much more interested in there's this community radio station in town that I listen to all the time. Like I want the human recommendation. And I have, because I am exposed to so much AI information, I have discovered that there is this preference for it. It's sort of like the difference between buying buying a pack of like chocolate chip cookies, like Keebler chocolate chip cookies, and then getting some that have been made in a bakery. Like the
Hmm.
ones made in the bakery are just so much better. The ones made from scratch, not in a machine. And I think the same is going to be true of information. That's my optimistic, hopeful take on how we're going to incorporate AI into journalism and content. But it's entirely possible that 90% of what we're going to be consuming 2 years from now is AI generated, and we're not going to give a crap. I'll be very depressed if that ends
Well,
up
I
being.
mean, I will say that in doing research for this season of our show and asking chat, albeit what it thinks, and yeah, it thinks that broadcast journalism is going to be one of the first to fall. Now, I am old enough to ask why would anyone want to get their news from Max Headroom, but apparently that's what chat thinks. So yeah, I do think it's a question, and I also wonder how that folds in with the business model because of course we also know that the business model that isn't necessarily holding with advertising space and things like that being lost to social media, etc. So do we shift to those spaces? And I'm gonna do a no here and ask a compound question, but how important how aware should we be of weighing the importance of virality versus quality content? Because a really good story might not go viral, but if you're going to be in the digital social media space, virality is everything.
Well, and that actually circles back on the business model, right? The reason that people want things to go viral is because that's how you get paid, right? Because the business model where you are selling advertising messages against the body of eyeballs or ears that listen to something, the more you have, the more you get paid. So the business model first, where's the business model going? It's definitely going to subscriptions, right? And so people will pay for content that is valuable, and content that is free then becomes less valuable, often really annoying and addictive, right? Like free content either tends to be addictive or mediocre. So, and the stuff that you pay for because it's valuable, because you want to listen to this writer, or because you really like that this group of reporters focuses in on this one deep topic that you're interested in. You know, it could be parenting, it could be criminal justice, it could be, building community, whatever. So it's definitely going to subscriptions, and that's going to be how journalists are going to get paid, either working for news organizations that charge for their content or building their own independent businesses that way. The thing that AI can't do is go out and find new facts about a situation, right? And we saw that with the floods in Texas, right? So you have this devastating, completely unexpected event that affects thousands and thousands of people. And people need to know what happened, who died, why didn't anybody know that this was coming? And AI had zero things to do with turning up that information, right? People had to be on the ground and they had to get information. And you remember there was one story that went viral because it was fake news. And it was a story about two girls who were found in a tree that had been swept away from the camp, but they were alive, and they were found 7 miles or 10 miles downstream. Now, that story was told by human beings, right? There were two sources, right? There was a real estate guy from Austin who had taken it upon himself to go down and report out what was happening. And he was doing these videos, and it was just him talking into his camera and posting them to Instagram and to Facebook on what he found. And he was one of the first people to report that. But it was actually swirling around in social media. And he says he got it from a law enforcement person. And then a really small startup newspaper also reported it. And they reported it in a digital newspaper, reported it. And they swore the same thing, that they got it from law enforcement. Now, I actually think AI was the reason that those rumors were swirling, because somebody started a version of it. And then, people are in this very desperate situation, and they're scrolling on their phone, and they're picking up nuggets of information, tweets, and they're just trying to go viral with that stuff. And so AI perpetuates the misinformation, but it was humans that created it, right? It was humans that created the fake news. And so I think that tells us that the real news is important, right? Because the humans were also creating all the real news, and it was humans that debunked it pretty quickly and held those sources that platformed it accountable. And so, I think the value of what we do as journalists is going to be getting away from the screen and going out and talking to the human beings and getting your hands on the records, on turning up the new information, and then coming back. And we may use AI to get to some of that, but it's going to be the human judgment that tells you that, oh, this is important, right? Like there's going to be probably within a year, I would say, AI is going to be scanning every public meeting and creating summaries and telling journalists and everybody else, here's what happened at this meeting, and here's what's interesting. But it's going to be journalists that are going to pick through and say, oh, actually, right? So let me give you an example. County commission near me, the agenda had a bunch of things on it, and one of them was to give the county clerk a 44% raise. Right. So that is reported by AI. But a journalist is like record scratch, 44% raise. Who gets a 44% raise in government? What is that
Or
person?
what?
Right. Let me see what that person's salary is going to be. That person's going to be the highest paid person in the county. If this goes through, took a human to figure that out. Right. So humans are going to be important.
Well, I would also say, as a journalist who sat in some of those otherwise boring ass meetings, I'm looking for the reactions on everyone else's faces when the announcement gets made. Somebody is rolling their eyes. Somebody has just like is scribbling some sort of like infuriated note on something. Like I feel like that part of the context AI just can't grab and doesn't know to grab.
Right. Because then you think about like all the questions that you need to get answered to understand how it got to this point, right? So one question is, well, who put this on the agenda? You know who put it on the agenda? The clerk put it on the agenda. The person who's going to get the raise, right? Who, there's 3 people on the commission or 7 people on the commission. How did they all vote? And then why, somebody's got to ask those people, why did you vote in favor of this? Or why did you vote against it? Or why was this measure tabled? Right? These are all the sort of like the narrative behind the narrative. It really takes a human to figure it out.
For me, this conversation has been great because it actually, when we're talking about AI, I think there's always been this, again, there is a heightened sense of concern right now within the industry. And honestly, talking to you and listening to how you're talking, how you're discussing this in terms of humans will always be important in terms of getting the news. It's learning how generative AI or learning how AI can be used to help us tell our stories and help us in terms of information, that the best way of using the tool. And I guess right now we're in a space where we're still figuring that out. It's changing every day. It's becoming much more accomplishing, and every day it's becoming so much more every day. So I guess it's us also trying to figure out with the business model, and everything feels like it's so up in the air that I think trying to really breathe for a second and realize that humans are always going to be what's going to make the news ultimately. AI is the tool.
Well, and this weird thing happened in journalism, right? If you look at like the evolution of journalism and how we got to this point, right? So it used to be that like I worked at a newspaper, and, I was a police reporter. And so I would go down to the police station and I would talk to all the cops. I would run through all the detective offices. And then I would come back and I would just randomly find interesting stories and talk about what the cops were doing. Well, then we got to an era that internet became a thing and social media became a thing. And BuzzFeed sort of showed us that like, oh, you can create content specifically for the internet, made to go viral on the internet, right? And so then you're tapping into, it's not about like going out and finding something. It's more about just like putting a couple things together that nobody else had put together, or making it funny or being clever. But it was less about the original generation of information and more about how information was packaged. Then that became the business model, right? So anybody who makes money on the internet has been in this weird thing where you have to have so many new stories posted, which takes, if you're going to do it the old-fashioned way, a hell of a lot of resources, and you don't necessarily get the payoff for it. So there's a cheaper way to do it, which is to just have people, trolling social media and making clever memes or repackaging information that somebody else has originally reported, right? And so that then became the business model. So the business model tilted away from the original generation of facts. And now that AI is taking all the search traffic, that sort of cheap content isn't going to be rewarded anymore. And so we may be back to a place, I mean, no content is going to be rewarded anymore by search. So you're back in a place where we sort of need to build a relationship directly with the audience, where they are like, yes, I want to pay you to go get information about this, right? And so it could be that we've gone through a really dark age and we could be coming out of it. Again, I'm the eternal optimist.
I'll take it. I will take it.
Well, this has been great. We always love to ask this question of our guests at the end of the show, which is, what was your path into journalism?
So this is really going to date me. Do you guys remember there was a television show in the 1970s called Lou Grant?
I know of it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So Watergate happened, and then Hollywood started creating a bunch of shows about journalism. Lou Grant was one. Mary Tyler Moore was one. Right. There were a bunch of them. My family watched Lou Grant, and I was like 7 or 8 years old. I was a little kid, but there was a character on Lou Grant that was a photographer, and his nickname was Animal. And the great thing about Animal was Animal broke all the rules, right? Like he was always ducking under crime scene tape or sneaking into places to get photos. And he was always getting these amazing photographs. And so I originally wanted to be a photographer. And it was the combination of seeing somebody who was so rebellious and was bringing so much meaning. And, his rebellion was actually creating meaning in the world. That was really, really appealing to me. Now, I got out of photography because in the days of film, when you had to go into the darkroom and you pulled the film out of the canister in complete darkness and you spooled it onto this reel, and then you put it into the chemicals. And if you didn't spool it onto the reel right, the film would be touching other parts of the film, right? Because it's supposed to be on a spiral reel. And I was really bad at that. And I just I was not detail oriented enough to be able to learn how to spool that film. So I was like, I'll never be able to develop. So I went into writing, and so that's the story. It's a long one. Sorry. That probably went on.
Listen, we've heard all kinds of twists and turns.
It was great.
All right. Well, listen, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. This has been optimistic, which I think is what a lot of journalists are going to need to hear going forward. So that has been very, very helpful.
Keep hope alive.
Always, always. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.